Hey, welcome back. We are going to talk about testing 4 propositions about political participation. I'm going to be down here in this little box so that you can, I guess, see me and know that there's a human being behind all of this. Now, in thinking about testing these 4 propositions, I want to put it in context of our course objectives. The organizing theme of the course is the tension between individual choices and collective social outcomes. That's the core of the study of politics. To introduce students to the systematic study of politics by demonstrating how political scientists formulate and address questions of political and intellectual interest. So part of what we're doing here is focusing in on that learning objective, but also to provide you with a broad introduction to the foundations, the evolution, and the current functioning of American politics and the American political system. So in going about doing this testing, we're really capturing those 2 major objectives that I have for the class. Now, a little bit before we get into the testing, we're going to be using survey data. Survey data, or survey questions, are meant to take a concept and find a way to measure it. We want to measure, in this case, individual attitudes about things like whether somebody voted, whether somebody contributed to a political candidate, whether somebody's registered to vote, those sorts of things. And so we can do that by asking people. Now, survey methodology has a couple of different ways that it can go. There are telephone interviews that can happen on a random basis. They use a random number dialer to randomly call people and ask them questions. There are in-person interviews. This is where you might sit down with somebody who's going to conduct the interview with you. One of the advantages there is that in-person interviews, people tend to be more truthful when they're face-to-face with an interviewer. The problem with in-person interviews is that they're very expensive. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to put together in-person interviews with 1,000 or 2,000 people. More recently, a lot of surveys have started to go online, so capturing people's attitudes by finding them randomly online. Random sampling is really the core of this thing. That is, that for any given survey, everyone in the population that we're interested in describing, everybody has an opportunity to be part of the survey. Now, for a typical survey, we're only going to ask, say, 1,000 or 2,000 people out of the 300+ million people who live in the United States. The idea of randomness is what's important there. We're going to take a sample that is random, and then we're going to try to describe what the whole population is about. Now, this is something you're comfortable with, you're familiar with it, it's happened to you. If you've ever had a blood test, like let's say you go to the doctor says, I want to test your cholesterol. Well, what they're going to do is send you off to a lab. They're going to take a small vial or 2 of your blood, and then they're going to do their tests on that vial of blood. Now, that blood is a sample of all the blood in your body. We don't drain out all of the blood, test it, and then put it back inside of you. That would be deadly. So what we do is we take a sample. And from that sample, we try to say, okay, the level of cholesterol in your blood is X, based on this sample. Now, sometimes you get a bad sample. Sometimes, hopefully most of the time, you get a good sample. It's just the blood that happened to be passing by in the vein when they stuck that needle in. But we sort of work on the assumption that that is random. Now, there is going to be error associated with any random sample test, because it could be that at that point when that needle went in, that at that point your cholesterol for that vial was that much less or that much more than the real value. We don't know what the real value is. We're trying to estimate the real value. Likewise, when we take a random sample of American voters and ask them questions, we're assuming that they're relatively representative because everybody had a chance to get in, but sometimes you can just get bad samples. We recognize this. We recognize this in calculating the margin of error. So when we get a particular estimate, like look at the left-hand side here, where it says that the Democrat has 43% support in poll A, and the Republican has 48%. Well, we would say, hey, the Republican is up by 5%. But look at that. Look there where it says margin of error for single candidate support. It says the margin of error is plus or minus 3%. So that means that the Democrat support could be as high as 46% or as low as 40%. Likewise, those same margins applied to the Republican, their support could be as high as 51% or as low as 45%. So that's capturing the idea of error, that we're going to have error. The margin of error is based on how many people you ask. If you ask 10 people, your margin of error is going to be very large. If you ask 1,000 people, your margin of error is going to shrink. The more people you ask, the more accurate your measure is going to be. The problem is that the more people you ask, the more expensive your survey is going to be. So we have this trade-off between the cost of measurement and the accuracy of the measurement, but we acknowledge there is a range of values that is possible, and this is true of every measurement that is taken, whether it's in the social sciences or in the natural sciences, that there's going to be error associated with the measurement. We just have to accept some level of error. So as we are doing these surveys, we're going to be keeping in mind that we're trying to measure concepts, that those measurements will have some amount of error associated with them, and that what we're really interested in is where those differences are real. On the left side of this particular thing, because the margin of error is small, we can say that the Republican seems to be leading in the race, whereas on the right-hand side, because the margin of error is so much larger, the difference between the two candidates it's not real. It's not statistically significant. It's not something that we should invest a lot of belief in. It's, in effect, a tie. So you want to be thinking about those margins of error. So let's move on, now that we know the data that we're using in this particular case, to our propositions. So you'll recall the first proposition, proposition number 1, was that as the cost of participation increases, the rate of participation is going to decrease. The idea here being that as the cost of participation, as there are more demands on somebody's resources, the less likely they are going to be to choose to invest those particular resources in that form of participation. Now, Madison expected high levels of participation throughout the population. So as we move on to this next slide, I want you to keep in mind the downward curve of the cost-benefit conception as opposed to the flat line that Madison is suggesting. So what we've done here is to look at survey data, and look at different forms of participation across the horizontal axis, from low-cost forms of participation to high-cost forms of participation. So on the low end, voting. As we move up in terms of costs, campaigning for a candidate, attending a community meeting, taking time out of your day to go to a community meeting, contacting a public official, taking the time to sit down and write that email or that letter, like back in the olden days. That takes time and effort. Giving a campaign contribution, that's money straight out of your pocket, money you're not going to be able to use to buy CDs or pay your Netflix bill. So as we move across those different costs, we should see a decline if the cost-benefit perspective is correct. They should be roughly equal if Madison is correct. And as we look at this, we can see that among these respondents, 80% claim to have voted, as opposed to 44% who participated in a campaign, 38% who attended a community meeting, 21% who contacted a public official, and about 15% who made a campaign contribution. So we're seeing sort of that downward pattern that we expected from cost-benefit self-interest. We don't see universally high levels of participation. So this is something where we would say this result seems to support the cost-benefit perspective over the Madisonian perspective. Proposition number 2 says that rates of participation can be manipulated through public policy. Remember, we can make it more costly to participate or less costly to participate. After the Civil War and up into the 1960s, in certain states, especially southern states, they used something called a poll tax as a way to discourage African Americans in particular from participating by voting. Their logic was, well, only people who paid taxes ought to be able to vote in elections. So given that's the case, we don't want to discriminate against poor people, so we'll allow you to pay a tax. We'll call it a poll tax. And you pay this tax and you will be able to cast your vote. Now, this is asking somebody to incur a direct cost to themselves to participate. And it's not a small cost, as you'll see here in this receipt for the poll tax for this gentleman, that he paid, I think it was $1.50 that he paid for the right to vote. Now, in today's dollars, that's $13. So this man paid $13 in today's money to have the right to vote. That's a lot to ask of somebody to get them to participate in an election. Would you pay $13? Honestly, would you pay $13 to cast a vote in the upcoming election? Most people, I suspect, would say no. I mean, that's just too much. I need that money to do other things. It doesn't mean that you're not patriotic. It means that you're making a cost-benefit calculation. And that's the whole idea behind the policy in the first place, was to discourage people from casting a vote by putting a real money cost on it. Another way that this was done during the same period was by using literacy tests, by making people go not only to a specific place to register to vote, but by then putting up a barrier to their registering to vote by saying, look, you have to prove that you are literate, that you can read and write. Now, you can come back at another time when we're going to give a literacy test that tests that, but we'll also allow you to do an oral test. But the oral tests were incredibly impossible for most people. Look at the questions that they're asking. What is a Republican form of government? I mean, before you took this class, could you really have answered that question? For most people, the answer is no, or the three branches of government. But where it really gets nasty, and this was a 30-question exam that people had to do, was number 14. What are the names of the persons who occupy the following state offices in Georgia? Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, Attorney General, Comptroller General, State Treasurer, Commissioner of Agriculture, State School Superintendent, Commissioner of Labor. Could you answer more than a few of those for the state of California today? Most of us couldn't. I know I couldn't answer those questions. So if I was asked these questions, I would not be allowed to vote. Again, it's about putting up barriers to stop certain groups from casting a vote by making it more costly. Now, you could study for this test, and people did study for the test, but think about the opportunity cost there. Hours and hours and hours and hours to prepare yourself for this test. That is asking a lot from people. So we can also put into place policies that will make it less costly to participate in elections. We did this back in the 1990s through a piece of legislation called the Motor Voter Bill, passed through Congress, House and Senate, signed by President Clinton. And what it said, in essence, was people should have the opportunity to register to vote when they are having an interaction with government, either at the state or the federal level. You are going to renew your driver's license. Well, since you're here, why don't you register to vote? We're going to get you at a point where just a few extra pieces of effort and we can register you to vote. And so this legislation went into place in 1993. And what we can see, especially among low-income individuals, is that up until the Motor Voter Bill was passed, we were seeing declines in low-income voters registering to vote. After, it started to edge back up again. Not quite to the same level that it was before, but it provided that opportunity for somebody to register easily. Now we have online registration. You don't even have to go to the DMV. You can register online. That's a low-cost way to get people to register, and we're getting higher levels of registration because we have made it easy. Let's think about this more systematically. In 2012, the average voter turnout across the entire country was 58.2%. Now, in vote-by-mail states, we see that those rates of participation are higher. Oregon and Washington use vote-by-mail exclusively, and they had participation rates well over 60%. From a cost-benefit perspective, what this is about making it easier. You don't have to go on a particular day during a particular set of times to cast your vote. No, we'll send you the ballot so that you have a couple of weeks to fill it out and send it in. You're going to be doing your bills and other stuff anyway. Hey, why don't you just cast a vote? Some states make it easier to simply vote in person. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, they have same-day registration. So you don't have to plan to register to vote ahead of time or anything like that. You show up at your polling place. They have a computer, and they know who's registered to vote. So we'll just register you to vote and then give you your ballot. Off you go. Here you're getting over 70% participation in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Flip side of that is policies that seem to drive down participation. In Tennessee in 2008, there was 57% voter turnout. In 2012, it dropped down to 52%. Now, what happened between 2008 and 2012? Well, in Tennessee, what they did was they required a photo ID in order to cast a vote. They didn't do that in 2008. In order to register to vote, you had to prove your citizenship, which can be a tough thing for some people to do. If I were to be demanded, if somebody demanded right now, I want you to prove that you're a citizen, I would have to go find additional documentation to be able to show that. I'd have to find out where my passport was and or my birth certificate. As of right now, I don't know where those things are. So I'm going to have to invest this extra effort in order to be able to register. And then also in Tennessee, they shortened the period of early voting. Early voting means you don't have to show up on a particular day. We'll open up the polls a week ahead of time or 2 weeks ahead of time so that you have a nice long window in which you can go and vote at any point in which it fits into your plans for the week. By putting into place these various barriers, Tennessee was able to drive down the rate of participation. And presumably because they wanted some people to vote and not other people to vote. We don't know exactly what their plan was. Proposition number 3 says those with more political resources can bear the cost of participation and will participate more often. So on the horizontal axis here, as a measure of political resources, we have level of education. It's been arranged from less than high school up through a graduate degree, and then the percent voting in the election. If you have less than a high school degree, there's about a 60% chance that you are going to participate in the election. As you go across that bottom axis, where people have more and more and more resources, what you see is a general linear increase in participation. So less than high school, 60%. Graduate degree, 92%. If you have a graduate degree, you are almost certain to cast a vote. That's a pretty big difference across those demographics. Let's look at another measure of resources, family income. So this is just money. Along the horizontal axis, from less than $15,000 a year to more than $110,000 a year. Again, we see that relatively linear increase among low-income voters. They're not as likely to vote as among high-income voters. Both of these findings seem to support the idea that the more resources you have, the better able you are to bear the cost of participation, the more likely you are to participate. Where the rubber hits the road, as I've said, is proposition number 4. As the cost of participation increases, the resource bias increases. As the cost of participation increases, people with fewer resources are less likely to get involved. People with more resources, more likely to get involved. For that reason, when it comes to higher cost forms of participation, we're going to expect to see overrepresentation of high status groups in these more costly forms of participation. So let's take a look at this. First of all, what I did was to classify Americans into two groups by social status, high social status and low social status, by looking at their income and their education. When you break it down this way, you see that about 85% of the American public, it falls into that low social status category. And about 15 to 16% fall into that high social status group. So this is a group that we might describe as an elite. So if the resource bias hypothesis is correct, what we should see is that as the cost of participation increases, that those high social status people will be more and more and more overrepresented in different forms of participation. What we're looking at here is the relationship between the resource bias and participation. So we have different types of participation: voting, campaigning, taking part in a community meeting, contacting an elected official, and making a contribution. So we go from low cost forms of participation, voting, to making a contribution, the highest cost that we have here as a measure. Now, down here in the lower left, that's the breakdown of the entire country. About 85% low social status, about 15% high social status. Now over here, the green represents low social status individuals, the blue high social status individuals. So when it comes to voting, about 85% of people fall into the low social status group, and among voters, about 82% are low social status. So that's pretty close. The cost of voting is low. Lots of people can bear the cost. When it comes to campaigning, low social status individuals make up about 85% of the population, and about 88% of those who got engaged in a campaign. So again, pretty close to representative. From there on out, that's where we see the resource bias begin to increase. When it comes to community meetings, even though high social status people make up only 15% of the population, they are 24% of the people who attended community meetings. What this suggests is that community meetings are not representative of the entire population. Likewise, for contacting an elected official, about the same level of bias. High social status individuals are overrepresented. And then when it comes to making campaign contributions, the percentage of high social status individuals essentially doubles from 15% to 32%. That is, 15% of the population gave 32% of the contributions. And in terms of money, it's probably a lot more money. So let's think about this in a different way. This is the same set of results that we just saw, but I just turned it into a bar graph to make it maybe a little bit more understandable to those who think this way. So what these bars represent is the overrepresentation of high social status individuals. So when it's voting, a little representation. When it's campaigning, a little less representation. But then from there on out, we see that sort of curve that we would expect to see based on cost-benefit self-interest. Why is this important? Well, it's important because it helps to determine the voices that are going to be heard when our elected representatives hear from the public, from voters in a community meeting. Also, the people who are going to get representation because they're actually active in the political process. So I want to take a quick look at the idea of descriptive representation. Descriptive representation has to do with what our elected officials and what our voters sort of look like in terms of income, in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of gender. Are the people who are getting elected, are they representative of America as a whole? Or is it the case that because the cost of participation is high, because they can bear the costs, that high social status people are overrepresented in our institutions, not to mention our voting? So one way to look at this is by looking at the issue of gender and race. So in the United States population, women make up 51% of individuals, males make up 49%. I always find this difference to be interesting. You'd think that it would be 50-50, but there's actually more women in the population than there are men. And the way I explain it is men are just stupid. Men do dumb stuff. They speed in cars, they go to war, they die. And so there are going to be more women than men because women are smarter than men. Now, when we look at the makeup of the Congress, what we see is that, at least in the 113th Congress, 82% of our members of Congress are men and just 18% are women. So men are overrepresented in Congress relative to their numbers in the population. Likewise, old folks make up 13% of the population, and yet they're 26% of Congress, overrepresentation of old folks. Race, there are obvious differences here. White people make up 63% of the population, and yet they're 83% of members of Congress, with folks from other categories of race being way underrepresented in most cases, way underrepresented relative to their numbers in the population. So descriptively, Congress does not look like the American public in terms of gender, in terms of age, or in terms of race. Moving on to education, there are big differences in levels of education. So let's look at people who have gone to college, who have earned a bachelor's degree. In the United States, according to this graphic, 28% of Americans have achieved a bachelor's degree. And yet in Congress, we see 95% of them have bachelor's degrees. And this becomes even more pronounced when we look at graduate degrees. 10% of people in the United States have graduate degrees, and yet 2/3 of members of Congress have graduate degrees. I mean, there are a lot of lawyers and other professional folks who are serving in Congress, a lot more than we would find in the general public. In fact, 41% of Congress is made up of lawyers, while lawyers as a population make up less than 1% of the entire U.S. population. There's an overrepresentation of lawyers, of people with graduate degrees, of people with college degrees, even people with high school degrees. Likewise, when it comes to income, we find that Congress is very much not representative of the rest of us. When we look at the general population in America, millionaires make up 1%, that top 1% that Bernie Sanders is always going on about. But in Congress, more than half of the members of Congress are millionaires. So we are being represented by people who don't look like us in terms of things like age and race and gender. We are being represented by people who are more highly educated, and we're being represented by people who make more money than most of us do. That is potentially a problem. from sort of a civics class perspective, we expect that everyone is going to participate. In fact, Madison says we're self-interested, we're going to get involved, we're going to join factions. That's what's going to happen. And yet, when we look at our representatives, when we look at the people who vote, when we look at the people who join interest groups, in every case, those people are not representative of our population as a whole. The potential problem here is that their voices will be heard. The voices of ordinary people who can't bear the cost of participation won't necessarily be heard. One way that I like to illustrate this is, by asking you, do you know of a local public golf course? A local public golf course. A golf course that is run either by or on the behalf of your city or your county, where people can go golf. Now, it's always been odd to me why government would be in the business of running golf courses. Why do they do that? Well, because golfers tend to make more money and have higher levels of education. They tend to be the ones that our elected officials hear from, especially when there's a threat to close down the golf courses. Oh my God, you can't do that. And that's all that our representatives will hear. You can't do that. Whereas other services that have a tendency to get cut, like, say, libraries, well, they're not used as much by people with high incomes. So when it comes up at the city council meeting, should we cut the budget of the library? The people in the room are there to talk about golf, not libraries. And so golf gets overrepresented, libraries get underrepresented, because the voices in the room are speaking to the interests of people with more resources. The people with fewer resources aren't even showing up in the room. And that is potentially a really big problem.